I didn't realize how quiet injustice could be until it became routine. Not the kind that screams or leaves bruises, just the kind that trains you to stand in corners to anticipate demands to disappear without being asked. In my own family, I learned how to move like furniture. Useful, replaceable, invisible. They called it helping out. I called it survival. Years went by with smiles that never reached their eyes, jokes that always landed on me, and responsibilities that somehow were never mine when success came knocking. I stayed silent because silence was safer. Because silence kept the peace. Or so I thought. That night they were celebrating. Glasses raised, laughter loud. A victory they believed was final. I was there too on the edges, doing what I always did when the room changed. Not with shouting, not with drama, with paperwork. A massive deal didn't just interrupt their celebration. It exposed everything they had ignored. And for the first time, my silence had a voice. Before we continue, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. If stories of quiet endurance and delayed justice speak to you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. I grew up in a house that looked orderly from the outside, the kind of place real estate agents love to photograph. Clean lawn, neutral paint, nothing that suggested imbalance. Inside, though, there was an unspoken hierarchy, and I learned my position in it early by watching who was listened to and who was tolerated. My older sister Emily was the benchmark. Teachers praised her. Neighbors asked about her future. My parents repeated her achievements like a resume they were proud to submit to the world. I followed the rules, kept my grades steady, stayed invisible enough not to cause concern. That invisibility slowly became my role. I wasn't the problem child. I was the extra one. After college, our paths split in a way that felt small at first but widened every year. Emily moved into consulting, then married Mark, who climbed a corporate ladder with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Promotions came with relocation packages and bonuses that sounded unreal when spoken out loud. Their lives filled with meetings, flights, and celebrations that had dress codes. I took a job that paid hourly. It wasn't shameful, but it wasn't impressive either. I told myself it was temporary a step while I figured things out. That word followed me for years. When my parents' health started to decline, everything changed quietly. Not overnight, not with a crisis. Just a series of small accommodations that added up. My mother needed help organizing medications. My father couldn't drive as easily. Appointments multiplied. Someone needed to be available during work hours, someone flexible. I was flexible. Emily lived 3 states away. Mark's job was too demanding. They talked about flying in more often, but flights are easy to postpone when someone else is already handling things. I moved back home to help for a few months. Everyone agreed it made sense. Everyone thanked me at first. The gratitude faded faster than I noticed. Tasks became expectations. Requests became assumptions. My schedule stopped being mine. If I mentioned work conflicts, my mother would look worried, my sister would sigh, and Mark would remind me how lucky I was not to be tied to an office. "You've got the freedom," he said once, smiling. Freedom is a strange word when you can't leave. I managed insurance calls, medical forms, house maintenance, groceries, prescriptions. I cooked because it was easier than explaining why I was tired. I cleaned because clutter made my parents anxious. I slept lightly because listening became a reflex. My phone was always on volume up just in case. Emily and Mark visited on weekends that fit their calendar. They brought wine compliments and stories. People praised them for being devoted children for making time. I stood behind them in photos, the one holding a coat or a bag. No one asked how long I'd been there or what it cost me. When decisions were made, I wasn't invited into the discussion. But I was always there for the execution. "Can you handle this? Can you take care of that?" The answer was expected before the question finished. Money complicated everything. Living at home meant I wasn't paying rent, a fact that came up whenever I hesitated. "We're helping you get back on your feet," Emily would say. "This is good for you right now." I nodded because arguing felt ungrateful. Because I didn't want to look like I was counting. I started turning down opportunities without admitting it out loud. A promotion that required travel. A position in another city. Each time there was a reason it wouldn't work right now. Each time I told myself it was temporary. At family gatherings, jokes were made casually, always landing in the same place. "You've got it easy. No real stress, right?" They laughed. I laughed too because correcting them would have taken more energy than I had. No one saw the erosion. How my world shrank to a routine of needs that reset every morning. How my identity narrowed to what I could provide. How being dependable slowly replaced being valued. The word servant was never spoken. It didn't need to be. It lived in the tone used when my name was called from another room, in the way conversations paused until I finished a task, in how my opinions were treated like optional footnotes. One night, after a long day of paperwork and calls, my father thanked me quietly. No audience, no ceremony, just a tired squeeze of my hand and a look that said he knew what this cost. That moment mattered more than any public praise. It reminded me I wasn't imagining the weight of what I carried. But gratitude doesn't change power. It doesn't rewrite roles. And it doesn't protect you when the people benefiting from your silence start believing it's owed. I began keeping records without a plan attached to them. Emails saved, dates written down, hours noted. At first, it was practical. Insurance companies demand proof. Over time, it became something else. A way to mark that I existed beyond chores and compliance, that my time had shape and substance even if no one acknowledged it. Emily and Mark started talking more openly about their future. Expansion, investments, a big win on the horizon. They spoke with certainty, like people already spending money they hadn't received yet. Their confidence filled rooms. Their plans assumed stability, support, and someone else handling the details. That someone was me. I listened from the edges, wiping counters, sorting mail, making sure everything ran smoothly. They talked about celebration, about finally relaxing after years of effort. I didn't interrupt. I rarely did. I believed endurance was strength, that staying quiet was maturity, that eventually balance would return on its own. I didn't know then that endurance was being mistaken for consent, or that silence carefully documented was already becoming something else. The shift from being helpful to being necessary didn't happen with a conversation. There was no meeting, no agreement signed across a table. It happened the way erosion does, slow, quiet, disguised as convenience. When my mother's condition stabilized, no one suggested I move back out. When my father recovered enough to manage short drives, no one offered to take over appointments. The assumption had settled I was there. I would remain there. The house functioned because I did. Emily framed it as responsibility. Mark framed it as efficiency. "You're already there," he'd say, scrolling through his phone while I stood nearby. "It just makes sense." Eventually makes sense turned into structure. Emily asked me to help formalize things just to keep everything organized. A simple arrangement, she said. A few documents. A practical solution. I didn't realize then that paperwork can lock you into roles more effectively than words ever could. They had me listed as a live-in caregiver for insurance purposes. It made claims smoother, reduced out-of-pocket costs. On paper, it looked generous. On paper, I had housing. On paper, I had purpose. What the paper didn't show was that my labor had been priced at zero. There was no salary, no hourly rate, no clear end date. When I asked casually how long this arrangement would last, Emily waved it off. "We'll see how things go. Don't stress." But stress doesn't ask permission. My days began before sunrise and ended whenever the house went quiet. Calls during my work shifts became normal. "It'll just take a minute." Emergencies blurred into errands. Errands blurred into obligations. I learned to answer my phone with an apology already forming. Mark started including me on emails, always as a CC, never a decision maker. "Looping you in," he'd write, then assign tasks beneath it. He spoke about me in meetings I wasn't invited to, referring to me as handling things on the ground. On the ground, like support staff in someone else's operation. When I pushed back gently, carefully, it was reframed. "We're all making sacrifices. This is family. You don't want to put extra strain on Mom, do you?" The moral leverage was flawless. Any resistance could be painted as selfishness, so I stopped resisting. Outwardly, inwardly something shifted. I began paying closer attention to language, to what was promised versus what was written, to the gap between appreciation and accountability. When you're invisible, observation becomes your defense. I noticed how often my work was referenced without my name attached, how accomplishments were collective when credit was useful, and individual when blame was needed. I noticed how quickly gratitude disappeared once it was expected. The contracts Emily had me sign were vague by design. Care assistance, administrative support, temporary housing. Each phrase flexible enough to stretch indefinitely. I signed because refusing would have created conflict I couldn't afford, Not emotionally, not financially. But I kept copies. Every form, every email, every version. I didn't know what I was preparing for. I only knew that clarity mattered. That one day someone might ask questions no one else wanted answered. My personal life narrowed further. Friends stopped inviting me places after enough cancellations. Dating felt impossible to explain. I can't make plans because my family might need me isn't attractive, especially when you're not even sure if it's true. Emily and Mark's life expanded in the opposite direction. New contacts, new investments, new language. They spoke in acronyms and projections. They talked about scale. One evening, Mark mentioned a deal they were close to closing. Big numbers, long-term impact. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed momentum itself was proof. I listened quietly, filing away details without comment. I already knew more than he realized. Through the administrative work, I handled filings, correspondence, background documentation. I had access to information they skimmed past. They trusted me with logistics because they didn't see logistics as power. To them, power lived in boardrooms and titles. They forgot that deals are built on details. There were moments when the imbalance became impossible to ignore, like when Mark joked in front of guests that I was basically part of the staff now. Laughter followed. I smiled because correcting him would have caused discomfort, and discomfort was always my responsibility to manage. Later that night alone, I opened my files and added notes. Date, context, witnesses, not out of spite, out of necessity. Memory fades, documents don't. What made it harder wasn't cruelty, it was normalcy. They weren't villains in their own minds. They believed the arrangement was fair because it worked for them, because I didn't scream, because I stayed. Silence can be misinterpreted as consent when people benefit from misunderstanding it. The house felt smaller as the roles hardened. My room became a storage space for paperwork. My time stopped being measured in hours and started being measured in tasks completed. I learned to eat, standing up to sleep lightly to be ready. Sometimes I wondered who I would be if I left. The thought felt distant, almost theoretical. Leaving would require resources I didn't have, leverage I hadn't claimed, proof I hadn't yet needed. So I stayed. I observed. I documented. They thought they had defined me through paperwork and necessity. They didn't realize paperwork cuts both ways. And while they celebrated progress, convinced everything was under control, I was quietly learning exactly how much control they didn't have. The celebration was planned weeks in advance, which in itself told me everything I needed to know. You don't schedule certainty unless you believe the outcome is guaranteed. Emily called it a small family gathering, but the guest list kept growing. Colleagues, investors, friends of friends who wanted to be near success while it was still warm. The house transformed in stages. Fresh paint in the living room, rented furniture to replace the worn pieces, catered food ordered with more confidence than caution. And me, I was assigned logistics. Emily handed me a checklist like it was a favor. "You're amazing at this," she said, already turning away. Pickups, setup, timing, making sure nothing disrupted the flow. I nodded and took the list because refusing would have required an explanation, and explanations were a luxury I'd stopped affording myself. Mark was in his element. He practiced speeches in fragments, testing lines out loud while pacing. He talked about the deal like it had already closed, already changed their lives. Numbers floated through the house, 7 figures, equity percentages, timelines measured in quarters. No one corrected him. Confidence doesn't invite interruption. I moved through the days before the event, like stage crew before opening night, ordering supplies, confirming deliveries, coordinating with caterers who called me sir and thanked me for being organized. They assumed I was in charge. I didn't correct them. The night of the celebration arrived, dressed in perfect timing. Clear weather, soft music, laughter that echoed off walls recently repainted to impress. Guests arrived in waves, carrying wine and expectations. Compliments flowed freely. "This place looks incredible. You must be so proud." Emily accepted praise like it was owed. Mark accepted handshakes like contracts. I took coats, refilled glasses, disappeared into the kitchen when needed. The rhythm was familiar. Someone asked who I was. Emily answered without hesitation. "Oh, that's my sibling. They help out around here." The way she said it, casual, dismissive, made the role official. I stayed quiet. At one point, Mark raised a glass and began speaking about the journey. Hard work, risk, vision. The room listened, nodding at the right moments. I stood near the doorway, balancing a tray, watching people applaud an ending that hadn't arrived yet. What struck me wasn't the arrogance. It was the absence of doubt. They truly believed nothing could interrupt this, that every variable had been accounted for, that the foundation was solid. I knew better. Not because I was smarter, because I was closer to the details. Halfway through the evening, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned slightly, then slipped it back into his pocket. Business during celebration? Unavoidable, he'd say later. He continued smiling. Emily caught my eye and gestured toward the kitchen. More ice, more glasses. Keep things moving. I complied, feeling the familiar tightening in my chest, the one that comes when you realize you're part of the scenery. In the kitchen, I paused longer than necessary, took a breath, looked at the notes on my phone. The files stored there, the emails time-stamped and archived, the contracts scanned and labeled. I hadn't planned this moment, but I recognized it. Back in the living room, conversations shifted toward the future. Expansion plans, new offices, celebrations yet to come. Someone joked about how nice it must be to finally relax. Mark laughed the loudest. Then the doorbell rang. Emily looked surprised. "Is anyone else coming?" she asked. No one answered. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to open the door. A courier stood there holding a large envelope clipboard ready. "Delivery for Mark Collins," he said, reading carefully. Mark stepped forward, irritation flashing briefly before curiosity replaced it. "That's me." The courier asked for a signature. Mark signed quickly, already turning back toward the room. The envelope was thicker than expected, heavier. Official, the kind of thing you don't open casually. Emily leaned over his shoulder. "What is it?" Mark shrugged. "Probably final confirmations." He waited until the courier left before opening it. The room quieted, just enough for curiosity to ripple. He skimmed the first page, smiling at first, then slowing. His brow furrowed. He flipped the page, then another. Someone asked if everything was okay. Mark didn't answer immediately. I stood a few steps back, watching. Not because I enjoyed the tension. Because I'd seen this document before earlier that week, forwarded quietly to an address they never checked themselves. Emily reached for the papers. "What is it?" Mark pulled them slightly away, scanning for something specific. A line. A name. His jaw tightened. "It's just legal stuff," he said too quickly. But the room had noticed. Celebration thrives on momentum. Doubt kills it instantly. One of the investors asked a question. Mark deflected. Another guest glanced at their watch. The music kept playing, but no one was listening anymore. I felt the shift before anyone spoke it aloud. The energy changed. Not dramatically, subtly, like air pressure before a storm. Emily looked at me then, not with authority, but with something closer to uncertainty. "Did you know about this?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Not because I wanted power, because I wanted accuracy. "I knew it was coming," I said finally. Calm, neutral, true. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that forces attention. Mark stared at me, really stared, like he was seeing me for the first time. "What do you mean you knew?" I met his gaze without raising my voice. "I mean, it's part of the process. It always was." The celebration hadn't ended yet. Not officially. Glasses still clinked softly as people shifted uncomfortably. Smiles froze in place, waiting for reassurance that never came. This wasn't the confrontation. Not yet. But the certainty they'd built the night on had cracked. And cracks, once visible, have a way of spreading. After the courier left, the house never quite recovered its rhythm. Music kept playing, but conversations thinned into cautious clusters. Laughter came late and landed wrong. People sensed something had shifted, even if they didn't yet understand what. Mark retreated to the study with the envelope. Emily followed her heels sharp against the floor. The door closed, not slammed, but firmly enough to signal exclusion. Guests pretended not to notice. I resumed clearing glasses, moving automatically, my hands steady in a way my chest wasn't. I didn't feel triumph. I felt inevitability. The document Mark held wasn't dramatic on its own. No threats, no accusations. Just language, precise, cold, legal. A notice of conditional approval tied to final verification. Verification that depended on information I'd provided months earlier quietly in my capacity as administrative support. They'd assumed those forms were procedural. I'd known they were structural. In the kitchen, two guests whispered. "Is everything okay?" one asked me gently, as if I were staff hired for the night. I nodded. "Just business," I said. It wasn't a lie. Emily emerged first, face composed too carefully. She clapped her hands lightly. Everything's fine, she announced. Just a minor detail. Mark followed, smile, fixed eyes sharper than before. They tried to restart the celebration. Another toast. Another round of applause. But momentum once broken is hard to manufacture. People checked their phones more often. Conversations drifted back to neutral topics. Someone mentioned traffic. Mark caught my arm as I passed. His grip was polite but firm. "We need to talk later," he said under his breath. "Not a request." "Of course," I replied just as quietly. Later came sooner than expected. Within 30 minutes, guests began making excuses to leave. Emily hugged them tightly, thanking them for coming. Mark shook hands, his voice still confident, still professional. When the door finally closed on the last goodbye, the house felt suddenly too large. Emily turned on me first. "What was that?" she demanded, dropping the smile she'd worn all evening. "Why would legal send something like that now? They sent it when it was due," I said. I kept my voice even factual. Emotion would only cloud the point. Mark stepped closer. "You said you knew it was coming." "How I've been part of the process," I replied. "You asked me to be." Emily scoffed. "You handle paperwork." "That doesn't mean—" "It means exactly that," I said. "Paperwork is the process." They exchanged a look. The kind that happens when two people realize they don't share the same information anymore. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "Look, if there's an issue, we can fix it. Just tell us what you told them." I met his eyes. I told them the truth. Silence settled heavier now without an audience. Emily's voice dropped. "What truth?" "That I was the one coordinating the operational side of the deal," I said. "That I held power of attorney for certain filings. That my name was attached to key submissions because you asked me to handle them." Mark frowned. "That was just for convenience." "Convenience has legal weight," I replied. They argued then, not with me, but with the situation, with assumptions they'd never examined. Emily paced. Mark reread sections of the document aloud, looking for loopholes. I stood near the counter, hands folded, waiting. When the volume rose, I didn't match it. Years of managing other people's emotions had taught me restraint. Raised voices don't change facts. Eventually, Mark stopped pacing. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. Not angrily, almost pleading. "I did," I said. "In emails, in meetings. You didn't think it mattered." Emily crossed her arms. "So what now?" "Now," I said, "they verify." Verification meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant timelines. Timelines meant exposure. The deal they thought was closed was suddenly conditional, dependent on clarity they no longer controlled. Over the next few days, calls came in rapid succession. Lawyers, analysts, compliance officers, questions layered on questions. Mark tried to manage it all, projecting confidence that cracked a little more each time he put the phone down. Emily oscillated between anger and bargaining. "You wouldn't really let this hurt us," she said one morning, voice soft, almost kind. "We're family." I looked at her, then really looked. "I'm not hurting anyone," I said. "I'm answering questions." She didn't like that answer. The house became tense. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms, then resumed in hushed tones. I continued my routines, appointments, paperwork, meals, but something fundamental had changed. They no longer saw me as background. They saw me as a variable. Mark asked to review my records. I handed them over without comment. Everything was labeled, time-stamped, cross-referenced. He flipped through the files, his expression tightening. "You kept all this?" "Yes," I said. "You told me to be thorough." He nodded slowly. "You were." The verification process expanded beyond what they'd anticipated. Meetings were scheduled, requests formalized. One of the investors asked to speak with me directly. Mark hesitated before passing along the message, but he did. He had no choice. On that call, I didn't advocate. I clarified. I didn't accuse. I confirmed. Dates, roles, responsibilities. I answered only what was asked, no more, no less. The person on the other end thanked me for my transparency. Afterward, Mark sat in silence for a long time. "They trust you," he said finally. "They trust the records I corrected." Emily tried a different approach. "If this deal falls apart," she said, voice tight, "it affects all of us." "I know," I replied. "And you're okay with that." I thought of the years I'd postponed my life. The opportunities declined. The quiet assumptions. The jokes. The celebration I'd served at like hired help. "I'm okay with the truth," I said. The verification didn't end the deal. It reshaped it. Authority shifted. Oversight increased. Names were reassigned. control redistributed in ways they hadn't planned for. They began to realize something I'd known for a while. The structure they relied on had been built on my silence, and silence, once documented, becomes leverage. This still wasn't the climax. No verdict had been issued. No power formally transferred. But the celebration was over. And for the first time, the outcome wasn't theirs to announce. If panic has a sound, it's the quiet kind, the absence of certainty where confidence used to live. The house filled with that silence over the next week. Phones buzzed constantly. Laptops stayed open on kitchen counters. Legal pads replaced wine glasses. The celebration decor came down piece by piece like evidence being cleared from a scene. Mark tried to regain control, the only way he knew how, by tightening it. Meetings were scheduled without me, then summarized in clipped bullet points sent late at night. I was asked to forward documents I'd already sent to clarify details I'd already clarified. Each request came with the same underlying assumption that access equaled authority. It didn't. Emily's approach was more personal. She hovered, offered coffee, asked about my day with a tone I hadn't heard in years. "We're under a lot of pressure," she said one morning, leaning against the counter. "This deal affects our future. We need to be aligned." Aligned meant compliant. It always had. I continued answering calls from the verification team. I didn't volunteer strategy. I didn't speculate. I read from records and stuck to facts. When asked to summarize my role, I did so plainly. When asked about decision pathways, I described them as they existed, not as Mark wished they had. The first real attempt to push me out came quietly. Mark slid a document across the table one evening after dinner. "This would simplify things," he said, not meeting my eyes. "It updates responsibilities, clears confusion." I read it carefully. Reassignment of authority, removal of my name from filings, retroactive language dressed up as administrative cleanup. It was clever. It was too late. "I can't sign this," I said, folding it neatly. Mark's jaw tightened. "Why not?" "Because it's inaccurate," I replied, "and because the verification process is active." Emily snapped. "You're being difficult." "No," I said. "I'm being precise." The pressure escalated. Subtle at first comments about how tense the house had become, reminders of how much they'd supported me, suggestions that I might consider moving out once things settled. Not threats. Implications. One afternoon, Mark closed the door to the study and lowered his voice. "If this deal stalls," he said, "people will look for reasons. Scapegoats." I met his gaze. "Then accuracy matters even more." He exhaled sharply. "You don't have to do this." "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm responding." The verification team requested a joint meeting. Mark agreed immediately, then tried to control the agenda. Emily insisted on attending. I was invited last, added to the calendar without comment. The meeting took place over video. Faces arranged in neat squares, lawyers, analysts, one senior partner whose questions were short and surgical. Mark spoke first, confident, rehearsed. Emily followed, framing the narrative in broad strokes. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly. I referenced documents by date and title. I described workflows. I explained why my name appeared where it did and how authority had been delegated, not assumed. The partner nodded occasionally, making notes. At one point, Mark interrupted. "That was provisional," he said. "We intended to revise." The partner looked at me. "Was that communicated in writing?" "No," I said. "Then we proceed with what exists," the partner replied. Calm. Final. After the call ended, the room felt airless. Emily accused me of undermining them. Mark accused me of inflexibility. I listened without responding, letting the words pass through me. This wasn't new. Only the stakes were. That night, I received an email from the verification team requesting additional documentation directly, not through Mark. It was professional, polite, decisive. Mark saw it on my screen and went still. "They're bypassing us," he said. "They're following the process," I replied. He laughed once bitterly. "You really planned this." I shook my head. "I prepared." "There's a difference." The next move was harsher. Emily suggested I take a break, citing stress. Mark mentioned consulting HR about my role. They floated the idea of bringing in external support consultants who would streamline operations. The implication was clear: replace me, then rewrite the story. But replacing a person doesn't erase a record. I forwarded everything requested. I didn't editorialize. I didn't defend myself. The more neutral I remained, the more the facts spoke on their own. Days later, a formal notice arrived, scheduling a public review session with stakeholders present. It wasn't a trial, but it wasn't private either. Attendance was required. Documentation would be presented. Questions would be asked. Mark read the notice twice. Emily sat down heavily. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "No," I said. "It wasn't supposed to be rushed. They stopped trying to persuade me after that. Strategy replaced emotion. Mark spent hours on calls. Emily rehearsed talking points. They treated the house like a command center, and me like a liability they couldn't remove. The night before the review, Mark knocked on my door. He stood there longer than necessary, uncertainty, softening his posture. "If there's anything you can do," he said quietly, "to keep this contained." I thought of the years I'd kept things contained. The cost of containment? "I already am," I said, "by telling the truth." He nodded once and walked away. The review would be public. Names would be spoken. Roles clarified. Authority confirmed. There would be no shouting, no drama, just documents projected on a screen and questions answered under oath-like precision. They had tried to push me aside to rewrite reality after celebrating it too early. But the structure they relied on had been built during years they barely noticed. And structures once inspected reveal exactly who was carrying the weight. The review session was scheduled for a Thursday morning, which felt intentional. Midweek, mid-quarter, a time when excuses were thin and calendars were supposedly clear. Attendance was mandatory for all named parties, and the list was longer than Emily and Mark had expected. Lawyers, senior partners, 2 representatives from the investment group, a compliance officer whose title alone suggested this was no longer just a formality. The notice specified that documentation would be presented in full view of stakeholders, public enough to matter, controlled enough to be irreversible. The night before, the house was silent in a way that felt heavier than shouting. Mark worked late in the study papers spread across the desk like defensive lines. Emily sat at the dining table, rehearsing statements under her breath, stopping occasionally to correct her tone. I stayed in my room reviewing the same files I'd reviewed dozens of times already, not because I needed to, but because routine was grounding. Sleep came in fragments. We arrived early the next morning at a downtown conference center, glass and steel reflecting a gray sky. The room assigned to us was large, designed for presentations rather than conversations. A long table, a screen mounted at the front, water pitchers already filled untouched. People filed in gradually, polite nods, brief handshakes, no small talk. Everyone understood this wasn't a celebration. Mark took the seat at the center of the table, posture, straight expression, neutral. Emily sat beside him, chin lifted, composed. I took a seat a few spaces down, not hidden, not central, exactly where I'd always been placed until now. The senior partner opened the session without ceremony. "This review is to confirm operational authority, compliance, alignment, and role attribution prior to final execution," he said. "Clear. Clinical. We will proceed sequentially." The screen lit up. A timeline appeared, dates, filings, signatures. The story of the deal told through documentation, not ambition. Mark spoke when prompted, outlining vision and leadership. Emily added context about growth strategy. Their words were confident, practiced, familiar. Then the compliance officer spoke. "We will now address discrepancies between assumed authority and documented authority." The next slide appeared. My name. Not large, not dramatic. Just there, attached to filings, approvals, correspondence, dates aligned, signatures matched. The room grew quieter, not with shock but with focus. The officer turned to me. "Can you confirm your role as listed here?" "Yes," I said. "One word." "Enough. Can you explain how these responsibilities were assigned to you?" I explained. Slowly, clearly. I referenced emails, delegations, requests made casually that became formal through action. I didn't assign motive. I described process. Mark shifted in his chair. Emily's jaw tightened. At one point, a representative asked, "Were you compensated for this role?" The question landed heavier than any accusation. "No," I said. "I was not." Silence followed, not uncomfortable but weighted. Notes were taken. The senior partner leaned forward. "Then we need to address a misalignment," he said. "Authority without recognition creates risk." The word risk echoed. Investors listen when risk is named. They asked more questions. About oversight. About checks and balances. About why a single individual outside the formal leadership structure held so much operational control. I answered as I always had, with facts. With records. Without emotion. Mark attempted to interject. This was temporary, he said. We intended to restructure. The partner nodded. Intent is not governance, he replied. Documentation is. Emily spoke, then voice steady but tight. We trusted family, she said. That's all this was. Trust. A word that shifts meaning depending on who benefits from it. The compliance officer didn't respond to that. He simply advanced the slide. The next section detailed risk mitigation, proposed changes, oversight adjustments, and then the conclusion. Based on the information presented, the senior partner said operational authority will remain with the documented holder until restructuring is completed under supervision. He looked directly at me. That is you. Mark's breath left him in a visible exhale. Emily stared at the table. This wasn't applause-worthy. There was no gasp. Just a quiet acknowledgement of reality settling into place. They continued outlining next steps. Formal contracts, compensation adjustments, public disclosure protocols, all discussed as if this outcome had been obvious from the beginning. Because on paper it was. When the session ended, people stood, gathered their things, and left in orderly fashion. No one lingered. No one offered comfort. This wasn't personal to them. It was structural. In the hallway, Mark finally spoke. So that's it, he asked. For now, I said. Emily turned to me, eyes sharp. You could have said something sooner. I did, I replied. It just wasn't convenient to hear. She looked away. Walking out of the building, I felt something unfamiliar, not triumph, not relief. Stability. The kind that comes when the ground stops shifting beneath your feet. The deal hadn't been taken from them. It had been paused, corrected, realigned. And for the first time, my role wasn't invisible. It was acknowledged in a room full of people who mattered. Justice hadn't arrived with noise. It arrived with a projector, a timeline, and the quiet authority of facts. Authority changes the temperature of a room, even after everyone leaves it. On the drive home from the review, no one spoke. Mark's hands stayed tight on the steering wheel. Emily stared out the window, jaw set as if watching the city pass might rearrange what had just been said. I sat in the back seat, posture unchanged, letting the quiet exist without trying to fix it. Back at the house, routines hesitated. Mark went straight to the study. Emily hovered in the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets without purpose. I placed my bag on the chair where I always did. The space felt the same. The roles did not. Within an hour, emails began arriving, copied to me directly, addressed to me first. Subject lines carried weight now. Operational clarification, authority, confirmation, compensation, framework. Each message was precise, polite, unmistakable. The structure had shifted and systems had noticed. Mark called a meeting that evening. Not a discussion, an announcement framed as collaboration. He stood at the head of the table, papers aligned, voice measured. We need to move forward, he said. Professionally. Emily nodded beside him, expression unreadable. I agree, I said. He outlined a plan to transition responsibilities under oversight. He spoke about minimizing disruption, protecting reputations, maintaining momentum. I listened without interrupting, waiting for the part that required my input. When he finished, I asked one question. Will this be reflected in writing before implementation? He paused. Of course. Then I'm open to reviewing it, I said. The meeting ended shortly after. There was nothing else to say. Over the next few days, the house filled with representatives, lawyers, consultants, auditors, people who spoke softly and carried folders. They asked me questions directly now, not as an afterthought. They confirmed timelines I'd documented years earlier. They asked how decisions were made when authority was ambiguous. Ambiguity isn't accidental, one consultant remarked quietly after a long afternoon. It just favors someone. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Emily tried once more to shift the narrative. Late one night, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, voice low. You don't have to do this, she said. You could let Mark handle it. I am doing exactly what's required, I replied. She frowned. You know this changes everything. Yes, I said. That's why it matters. She looked at me then with something like disbelief. When did you become like this? I considered the question. When I realized silence was being used against me. The first draft of the revised contract arrived 3 days later. It was thorough. Clear delineation of roles, compensation outlined in exact figures, authority mapped to responsibility, an end date defined. Nothing vague, nothing assumed. I read it carefully. Twice. Then I marked sections needing clarification, not removal, not expansion. Precision. Mark reviewed my notes with visible frustration. "You're being meticulous," he said. "I always have been," I replied. "You just didn't notice." The public acknowledgement came next, quieter than the review but more permanent. A stakeholder update circulated listing operational leadership as confirmed. My name appeared alongside titles I'd never been given before. No fanfare, no apology, just accuracy. Emily didn't speak to me for 2 days after that. When she finally did, it was brief. "They're asking for you," she said, gesturing toward the study. Inside, Mark stood with his phone on speaker. An investor thanked me for my diligence, for my steadiness, for holding things together during uncertainty. I accepted the thanks and redirected credit to the process. The call ended. Mark stared at the desk after. "They trust you," he said again. "They trust the system," I said. "I just followed it. The hardest part wasn't the conflict. It was the recalibration. Years of being ignored don't disappear because a title changes. Habits linger. Emily still expected me to handle logistics without asking. Mark still spoke as if decisions were his by default. Each time I corrected gently, firmly, and in writing. "This needs to be routed through the agreed channel," I'd say. Or, "Please include me on the approval chain." At first it annoyed them, then it slowed them. Then it worked. The deal resumed under supervision. Timelines adjusted. Authority clarified. Compensation began arriving in regular intervals, deposited with a consistency that felt surreal. I didn't celebrate it. I used it to rebuild what had been postponed, my own stability. One afternoon, an auditor asked how I'd managed to maintain such detailed records without directive. I answered honestly. "When you're not seen, documentation becomes your witness." He nodded. It did its job. The house changed again as people stopped coming. The consultants left. The lawyers reduced their check-ins. The space felt quieter, less charged. Mark worked more hours outside. Emily spent more time away. Distance grew not out of anger but adjustment. I wasn't asked to serve drinks anymore. I wasn't handed lists. When something needed doing, it came as a request, not an assumption. Sometimes it didn't come at all, and that was the point. One evening, Mark approached me in the hallway. "I underestimated you," he said. "Not an apology, not a confession, just a statement." "I know," I replied. He nodded once and walked away. Power doesn't need to humiliate to assert itself. It only needs to be consistent. What had been taken from me wasn't restored by confrontation or vengeance. It was restored by alignment between work and recognition, responsibility and authority, silence and record. The celebration they'd planned had been interrupted, yes, but what replaced it wasn't chaos. It was order. And order, when it finally arrives, leaves no room for dismissal. The first public consequence didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived with an invitation. An email from the investment group requested my presence at a quarterly stakeholder forum, a room Mark had always described as strategic and above my pay grade. The language was formal. The expectation was clear. Attendance wasn't symbolic. It was required. Mark saw the calendar invite before I said anything. He read it twice, then closed his laptop without comment. Emily didn't mention it at all. The forum was held in a hotel ballroom converted into a corporate space, neutral colors, long tables, a raised platform at the front. Name placards, marked seats. Mine was placed alongside executives and legal counsel, not behind them. That detail mattered more than the title printed beneath my name. When I took my seat, conversations paused briefly, then resumed. People adjusted quickly. Authority, once formalized, doesn't need explanation. The session began with projections and performance reviews. Numbers filled the screens. Growth curves. Risk assessments. Mark presented his section with practiced ease, but there was a new restraint in his tone. Every claim was measured. Every projection caveated. When questions came, they came to me as often as they came to him. "Can you confirm operational continuity? Have oversight protocols been implemented? What safeguards are now in place?" I answered calmly, referencing the same systems I'd built quietly over years. No embellishment. No defensiveness, just confirmation. One investor asked, "Why wasn't this structure visible earlier?" I didn't look at Mark or Emily when I answered. "Because it wasn't documented earlier," I said. "Now it is." There was no argument with that. After the forum, people approached me directly. Introductions, handshakes, offers of contact, not praise recognition. The difference is subtle but profound. Praise fades. Recognition sticks. Mark kept his distance that afternoon. Emily left early. I stayed to answer follow-up questions, then returned to the hotel room alone. That night, the official minutes from the review were circulated. They included a summary of authority, realignment, and noted that corrective measures had been taken in the interest of transparency and compliance. The language was neutral. The impact was not. Within days, secondary consequences followed. A related partnership paused pending review. Another requested amended terms. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dramatic. But momentum slowed, and when momentum slows, narratives change. Mark grew more cautious. Decisions that once bypassed process now stalled until approval was documented. Emily's tone softened in public, sharpened in private. She accused me of enjoying the shift. I didn't respond. Enjoyment implies intention. This had been correction. The most public moment came a week later during a scheduled press briefing. It was meant to be routine, an update on the deal's progress. Mark stood at the podium, notes in hand. Emily sat in the front row. I sat to the side, listed on the agenda. A reporter asked about internal restructuring. Mark answered carefully. "We've clarified roles to ensure long-term stability," he said. Another reporter followed up. "Can you specify who now holds operational authority?" Mark hesitated, just long enough to register. Then he said my name. Clear, unqualified, on record. Cameras clicked. Pens moved. The moment passed quickly, but it didn't vanish. It existed now, searchable and fixed. Afterward, Emily confronted me in the hallway. "Did you plan that?" she demanded. "No," I said. "I attended." She stared at me as if waiting for something else. An apology. An admission. None came. The legal consequences finalized quietly. Updated filings, revised contracts, compensation reconciled retroactively. Numbers appeared in statements that matched the work I'd done, not the role I'd been assigned. I reviewed them with care, signed where appropriate, and stored copies where they belonged. Mark attempted one last negotiation. "We can still shape this," he said, voice low. "Keep things internal." "They are internal," I replied. "They're just accurate now." The house felt different in the evenings. Less crowded, less expectant. I cooked for myself more often. I took walks without checking my phone. Small freedoms returned not as rewards but as defaults. Emily stopped asking me to help out. She started asking if I was available. Sometimes I said no. The world didn't end. One night she admitted something quietly. "I didn't think you'd ever push back." "I didn't push," I said. I stood. She looked away, absorbing that distinction. The public nature of the correction mattered. Not because it shamed anyone, but because it closed the door on revisionism. What happened had witnesses. What changed had records. The truth no longer depended on memory or mood. I didn't gloat. I didn't retaliate. I didn't rewrite the past. I let it be seen. Justice in this form wasn't about winning. It was about alignment between what was done and what was acknowledged. Between labor and authority. Between silence and documentation. The servant role they'd assigned me dissolved not because I rejected it loudly, but because it could no longer be sustained under scrutiny. And once a role is exposed as inaccurate, it can't be worn again. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They arrive in increments like interest compounding, quiet, unavoidable, mathematically fair. The first tangible shift was structural. The investment group instituted a temporary oversight committee, citing best practices during transitional alignment. It sounded harmless. It wasn't. Oversight meant approvals. Approvals meant delays. Delays meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant leverage changing hands. Mark felt it immediately. Meetings he used to lead were now observed. Decisions he once announced now required justification. His calendar filled with review sessions that ended without conclusions. Authority once assumed had to be demonstrated repeatedly. Emily experienced it differently. Her role had always been proximity access through Mark, influence through family. As the system formalized, proximity lost value. She found herself excluded from conversations she'd once shaped. When she tried to intervene, she was thanked politely and redirected. I didn't orchestrate any of it. I didn't need to. Systems once corrected enforced themselves. The partnership that had paused returned with conditions. Revised terms reduced risk exposure. Equity allocations shifted slightly. Control mechanisms tightened. Nothing dramatic enough for headlines. Significant enough to matter. Mark called it temporary friction. Investors called it necessary recalibration. At home, the atmosphere thinned. Not hostile, just distant. Mark spent more time away working late, returning with the tired restraint of someone managing decline without admitting it. Emily stayed busy, filling days with errands and lunches that avoided the house. When we did cross paths, conversations stayed practical, neutral. There was no longer an expectation that I would absorb discomfort to keep things smooth. One afternoon, a formal notice arrived, requesting documentation related to an earlier phase of the deal one Mark had overseen personally. The oversight committee had questions, clarifications, requests for records that didn't exist. Mark asked if I had copies. I didn't. For the first time, he was the one without documentation. The meeting that followed wasn't public, but it was decisive. Mark emerged quieter, posture changed. No accusations were made, no penalties announced. Just recommendations, leadership adjustments, delegated authority, support during transition. Support is a gentle word for removal. Emily tried to frame it as a misunderstanding. "They're just being cautious," she said one evening. "It'll pass." "It might," I replied. "If the records support it." She didn't respond. The Oversight Committee formalized new reporting lines. Operational decisions flowed through me before execution. Mark retained a title, but the substance of leadership shifted. Not overnight. Gradually. Irreversibly. What surprised me wasn't their resistance. It was their exhaustion. Fighting reality takes energy. Compliance, even reluctant, takes less. I didn't celebrate the shift. I focused on stabilization, clear schedules, documented approvals, transparent communication. The kind of work I'd always done, now acknowledged and resourced. Compensation adjustments finalized. Retroactive payments arrived with detailed breakdowns. Numbers that once felt abstract now landed with precision. I used them to settle debts, rebuild savings, reclaim postponed plans. Quiet repairs. Emily confronted me once more, frustration edging into desperation. "You could fix this," she said. "You could tell them Mark's essential." "I've already told them the truth," I replied. "That's the fix." She shook her head. "You're letting this destroy us." "No," I said. "I'm letting accuracy correct what was built on assumption." The public perception shifted subtly. Articles referenced operational realignment. Interviews focused on governance. Mark's name appeared less frequently. Mine appeared more, always attached to process, never to spectacle. At a networking event, someone asked how I handled the pressure. I answered honestly, by doing the same work I was doing before, just without pretending it didn't matter. The house grew quieter as Emily moved out temporarily. Mark followed weeks later, citing proximity to work. I remained not out of obligation, but until my own transition finalized. For the first time, staying was a choice. One evening, Mark returned to collect files. He paused in the doorway, looking around the space that had once functioned on my silence. "I never meant for it to go this way," he said. "I know," I replied. "Meaning isn't structure." He nodded, accepting the distinction, and left. The Oversight Committee concluded its review with a formal statement. Leadership responsibilities redistributed. Governance protocols adopted. The deal moved forward under revised terms. Stable, slower, sound. No one was punished publicly. No one was humiliated. The outcome wasn't theatrical. It was accurate. What they lost wasn't everything. It was certainty without accountability. Control without documentation. Comfort built on someone else's endurance. What I gained wasn't power for its own sake. It was alignment between effort and recognition. Between responsibility and authority. The servant role dissolved not because I rejected it loudly, but because it couldn't survive in a system that demanded evidence. And once evidence enters the room, stories adjust or collapse. Stability feels strange when you've lived without it for so long. At first it feels temporary, something you don't lean into because you're waiting for it to disappear. That was how the weeks after the oversight decision felt to me. Quiet, predictable, almost suspicious. The deal moved forward, under the revised structure. Meetings had agendas. Decisions had owners. Responsibilities were clear, documented, and most importantly, limited. My phone stopped buzzing at all hours. Emails arrived during business time. Emergencies became rare, not routine. For the first time in years, my days ended when they were supposed to. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. the way the house sounded when no one was rushing, the way sleep felt when it wasn't interrupted, the way my thoughts stretched when they weren't constantly redirected towards someone else's needs. Work became work, not obligation disguised as loyalty. I attended meetings where my role was expected, not questioned. When I spoke, people listened without translating my words through someone else's authority. It wasn't intoxicating. It was grounding. Emily and Mark existed at the edges of my life now, not removed entirely, just repositioned. We spoke occasionally, always carefully. Conversations stayed neutral, polite. There was no attempt to revisit the past, no apology offered, no demand made. I didn't need either. The first time I declined a request without explanation, I felt my chest tighten. "I'm not available for that," I said, voice steady. The world didn't tilt. No one accused me of being selfish. The request simply moved elsewhere. Boundaries, I learned, don't require defense when they're supported by structure. I moved out 2 months later, not in a rush, not in defiance. I found a small place across town, nothing impressive, nothing symbolic, just mine. I packed slowly, choosing what to take, what to leave. Emily wasn't there. Mark didn't ask when I was going. On my last night in the house, I walked through each room, remembering the years I'd moved through them quietly. I didn't feel anger. I felt completion. The next phase of my work expanded naturally. A consultant invited me to advise on governance. An investor asked if I'd consider a formal role. I didn't say yes immediately. For once I had time to choose. When I accepted, it was on my terms, documented, compensated, bounded. No assumptions, no ambiguity. At a public panel months later, someone asked how I navigated family and business without conflict. I paused before answering. By separating roles, I said, and refusing to let silence stand in for agreement. Emily watched that panel online. She texted me afterward. "I didn't realize how much you carried." It wasn't an apology. It didn't need to be. Mark never reached out again. I heard through others that he'd taken a role elsewhere, smaller, less visible. A reset, not a punishment. Sometimes people assume justice requires confrontation, raised voices, dramatic exits. Mine didn't. Mine arrived quietly through alignment, through documents, through rooms where questions were asked without regard for family dynamics. I didn't win by outshouting anyone. I won by being exact. The silence I'd lived in didn't vanish, it transformed. It became space. Space to think. Space to choose. Space to stand without bracing for impact. One evening, sitting in my own living room, I realized I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. The habit had faded. Stability had settled. The person I was becoming didn't need to prove anything to the people who'd overlooked me. Their recognition wasn't the point. My autonomy was. I learned that endurance is only strength when it's chosen. When it's imposed, it's exploitation. The difference lies in consent, and consent requires clarity. What changed my life wasn't exposure or revenge. It was structure. It was refusing to let my work remain invisible. It was understanding that truth, when properly documented, doesn't need to be defended. I stood straight not because someone lifted me up, but because the weight was finally distributed where it belonged. Distance has a way of clarifying things that proximity never allows. By the time the deal fully closed under the revised structure, my life no longer revolved around it or around the people who once controlled my time. The closing wasn't public. No champagne. No speeches. Just signatures, confirmations, and a final email marked executed. Clean, final, accurate. I read the message once, then archived it. What mattered more was what followed. The weeks after the close were calm in a way I'd never experienced. My calendar wasn't empty, it was intentional. Meetings had purpose. Rest had permission. Silence no longer meant tension. It meant peace. I took on a formal advisory role with clear boundaries and a defined contract length. My compensation reflected responsibility, not sacrifice. When questions arose, they came through proper channels, not family group chats or late-night calls. The difference felt almost unreal. Emily reached out once asking if we could talk. We met in a neutral place, a cafe neither of us had history with. She looked tired, older somehow, not broken, just recalibrated. "I didn't think it would end like that," she said. "It didn't end," I replied. "It changed." She nodded slowly. "I thought silence meant you were okay. I thought speaking up would cost me everything I said. We were both wrong." There was no argument, no reconciliation montage, Just understanding, partial and late, but real. Mark never asked to meet. I didn't need him to. Some relationships resolve through closure, others resolve through distance. Months later, at an industry event, someone introduced me as the person who stabilized that transition. The phrasing struck me. Not savior, not disruptor, stabilizer. Someone who made things honest enough to hold. I liked that. Looking back, I realized how carefully the injustice had been constructed. Not through cruelty, but through convenience. Not through malice, but through habit. Roles assigned without consent. Labor accepted without acknowledgement. Silence interpreted as agreement. That's how people become servants without chains. What broke the pattern wasn't anger. It wasn't confrontation. It was clarity. The moment clarity entered the system, everything else followed: oversight, correction, redistribution. Justice didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet, heavy in the chest, grounded. There are nights I still wake expecting my phone to buzz. Old reflexes don't disappear overnight, but they fade. And in their place comes something steadier. Trust in structure, in boundaries, in myself. I didn't escape by being chosen. I escaped by choosing myself. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this: silence can keep the peace, but it never creates justice. Justice requires records, names, dates, the courage to let reality be seen exactly as it is. I was treated like a servant because it was convenient to see me that way. I stopped being one the moment convenience met accountability, and that kind of justice delayed, quiet, undeniable lasts. There is a lesson hidden in quiet lives that rarely gets told out loud. Endurance is not the same as worth. Many of us grow up believing that if we stay patient, helpful, and silent long enough, someone will eventually notice. That loyalty will be rewarded. That fairness will arrive on its own. But real life doesn't work that way. What truly changes a person's fate is not anger, not confrontation, and not proving others wrong. It's clarity. The moment you understand your value, document your effort, and draw boundaries even silently, the world begins to adjust. Not because it suddenly becomes kind, but because it can no longer ignore what is clear. You don't need to shout to stand tall. You don't need revenge to find justice. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop shrinking yourself so others can stay comfortable. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, your workplace, or your relationships, this story is for you. Your quiet strength is not weakness. It's potential waiting for structure, truth, and the right moment to surface. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated simply because you stayed silent? What moment changed the way you saw your own worth? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if stories about quiet resilience, delayed justice, and emotional truth resonate with you, consider subscribing to the channel. New stories are shared regularly, and you're always welcome here.